Our guest on This is America and the World is Dr. Stephen West. Dr. West is Associate Professor of History at the Catholic University of America in Washington, and the focus of our conversation is the foundations of democracy, contested elections throughout American history, and a look ahead to the election of 2024. Steve, good to be with you this afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Looking at the election of 2020, still in some people's minds, still in dispute, running up to an election coming up in 2024. A lot of writing nowadays about democracy. Is our democracy threatened? What are the foundations of American democracy?
You know, that's a great question. For me as a historian, I tend to think historically rather than maybe philosophically and abstractly. So I think about how Americans have defined democracy and government by the people over time. So, for example, I think back to the Declaration of Independence, which speaks of government based on the consent of the governed. I think about the preamble of the Constitution of 1787, which is declared in the name of we the people. Uh-huh. I think I'm a historian who focuses on Civil War and Reconstruction, so I can't help but slip in a mention here of Abraham Lincoln, his Gettysburg Address, in which he speaks of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Mm-hmm. And so I think as Americans kind of historically have thought about our government, there's a clear notion that the government ought to be based on the consent of the people, but this sort of raises as many questions as it solves. How is that consent to be determined? How's it to be established, to be obtained? And then who exactly are the people? Who gets to have a say in government? What kinds of qualifications do we put, for example, on office holding or on voting? Mm-hmm. Property qualifications based on race or sex, qualifications based on literacy or tax paying. So all kinds of questions there that sort of very kind of inspiring words from some of our leaders, but they raise a lot of thorny questions about what democracy is and how we obtain that consent.
I wrote down a few things that I've been thinking about. Free and fair elections, transfer of power without undue chaos, respecting the rights of other people, and respect for the rule of law. Those are all things that I've been thinking about. Does that make sense to you in this idea of the foundations of democracy?
Yes, I think all of those are in some form or another in the Constitution. We've amended the Constitution over time. We've changed the Constitution to some extent by interpretation. But we still have that document of 1787, and it provides for various of the things you've just mentioned.
Looking at our elections over a long period of throughout our history, are they usually free and fair?
Depends on whether we're sort of judging by the standards of today or the standards of people at the time. I tend to think of democracy in the United States as perhaps less in crisis than in a sort of permanent state of contest, right? I mean, that is to say, there have been throughout American history people who have wanted elections to be more democratic, to have them open to a wider range of people, to make it easier to vote rather than harder. But we've seen throughout history people who would see that as a threat to their interests, who want elections to be more restricted, who want fewer people to vote, who want to make it harder to vote, right? And so some of the folks who would restrict access to the ballot have said that they are doing it in the name of free and fair elections, in the name of, to use the kind of contemporary term, election integrity. But those efforts are often perceived by their opponents as anti-democratic.
Throughout our history, is there a lot of fraud? That's the word nowadays. Is there a lot of fraud throughout our elections over the years?
There has certainly been fraud at times in the history of our elections. It seems to me that, in our sort of current climate, although there have been lots of allegations of fraud, the proof of that has been very as I mentioned, I'm a historian of the 19th century. There's a Thomas Nast cartoon of Boss Tweed, the sort of famous political boss of New York City from the 1870s. And Tweed is kind of leaning against a ballot box. And the caption of the cartoon is, in counting, there is strength. And Boss Tweed is saying, if I get to count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Huh? And so the notion is, I think a lot of the allegations of fraud that we're hearing today have to do with fraud by voters. That is, people who shouldn't be voting, people casting multiple ballots. Historically, to the extent that we've seen voter fraud, a good bit of it has been fraud, as Boss Tweed would have it, in the counting of the vote.
So there's the voting itself, and then there's the counting of the votes. Do you see with these new laws that are being passed and these audits that are being done, do you see a threat to not only the voting itself, but also the counting of the votes? I mean, is what's going on right now, some people would say, laying the groundwork for a challenge in 2024?
Yeah, and it certainly could be. As a historian, all I can say is we have to sort of wait and see what happens. Historians are not, seers of the future any better than anyone else. But certainly control of the machinery of voting and the counting of the vote, this has been historically one of the areas of controversy. So, for example, we see it in the late 19th century. I mentioned Boss Tweed before. We see it in the disputed presidential election of 1876. Yeah. As Reconstruction ends, when Southern Democrats come back into power, they're very careful about rewriting the laws of the Southern states to give them control of the machinery of voting at the local level, the registration of voters, and the counting of votes.
So you just referenced this one huge challenge. I think it was 1876. That's Rutherford B. Hayes, Tilden. Talk a little bit about that, because that was a huge challenge to the system, wasn't it?
Yeah. So this is a real shock to the system. 1876, the Civil War has been over for just a little bit more than a decade. Reconstruction has been taking place in the former Confederate states and the Southern states. Black men have been enfranchised. There has been a backlash against Black men's enfranchisement from many white Southerners, especially Democrats in the South, through fraud and through terrorism. They were seeking to gain control of state and local government in places throughout the South. There were a few states in which Republicans still held some power at the state level. In 1876, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida among them. And in those three states, there are essentially dueling sets of electors sent to Congress, because both Democrats and Republicans are claiming that they've won, and they've both established sort of control of some body of government that forwards on to Washington, a claim that theirs is the true ticket. And this matters especially in 1876. You mentioned the two main candidates there, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. Tilden, putting aside these three states, Tilden is one vote away from winning the Electoral College. And so Hayes has to win all three of them to win the presidential election of 1876. These dueling returns are sent to Congress. There is a time of sort of crisis and controversy in Congress. There's talk of violence. I know we think our media today is sort of particularly inflammatory, but there are editors in early 1877, so before the election is decided, who are talking about marching on Washington with 10,000 supporters to make sure that Congress counts the votes correctly. Ultimately, Congress appoints an electoral commission that decides the issue, and on a straight party line vote of 8-7, they award all of the disputed electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, and thus he becomes the president. But many Democrats refuse to accept the legitimacy of his presidency, not to the point of trying to storm the Capitol or trying to take back control by force, but they call him, in the phrase of the day, his name is Rutherford B. Hayes. They refer to him as Rutherford B. Hayes.
Let's hold on that note, take a little break. We'll get deep into our conversation, talking with Dr. Stephen West. Dr. West is on faculty in the Department of History at Catholic University of America. here in Washington. Take a little break, back on the other side with Dr. West, continuing our conversation about elections. This is America and the World. Underwriting for This is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy. So, Dr. West, when you read about the election being stolen, or you read or hear about the big lie, how does that set with you from the position of a historian?
Well, so it certainly brings to my mind, as a historian of Civil War and Reconstruction, the 1876 election. It reminds me that the system that we have for electing the president, the Electoral College, has historically, really from almost the beginnings of the Republic, been a source of dispute and confusion and dissatisfaction among Americans. So in 1800, there's a tie in the presidential election, not between candidates of two different parties, but essentially between candidates of the same party, Thomas Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. This throws Congress into a controversy because it's left to Congress to decide this, and sort of scheming Federalists try to decide between Burr and Jefferson which one of these two men will be better or perhaps least bad for them. This is partially fixed in the 12th Amendment, but we've had repeated controversies. The presidential election is thrown to the House of Representatives in 1824. We've had 5 occasions in the history of the country where the winner of the popular vote is not the winner in the Electoral College. Now, constitutionally, that doesn't matter one little bit, because the Constitution doesn't require any kind of popular vote for the presidential electors. But nonetheless, it does raise dissatisfactions among many people, and it can harm the legitimacy of an incoming president.
Do you think that people, so in a national election for president and vice president, there's a popular vote, and then there's the Electoral College, these electoral votes. I know that this is going deep into the weeds, so we'll try to kind of just paint with broad strokes of the brush. Are there holes in the Constitution regarding this business of the Electoral College and electoral votes as opposed to the popular vote?
You can call them holes. You can sort of simply see sort of opportunities or ambiguities that allow for gaming the system in various ways at various times, right? So it's sort of left to the states in the Electoral College, as it's written into the Constitution. It's left to the states to determine how their electors will be selected and how they will be apportioned. Most states pretty quickly go to a winner-take-all system in the early 19th century. Most also go to popular election of presidential electors, but it's not at all required in the Constitution itself. And so one of the proposals that we've seen in some states in the wake of the 2020 election is for state legislatures to establish some mechanism to themselves take back the appointment of presidential electors. We might regard that as sort of breaking norms, and in sort of the modern history of how we run presidential elections, it certainly is. It's not necessarily unconstitutional, though.
This is the part that I don't quite get. So there's a popular election, and Biden gets X amount of votes, Trump gets X amount of votes. And let's say in a particular state that Trump is the winner or Biden is the winner. It doesn't make any difference. How are those electors selected? Is it just kind of a honorary position that, and this winner-take-all business that comes into play, with the exception of a couple of New England states, but for the most
Right.
part.
Maine and Nebraska do it a little differently today, but in every other state and the District of Columbia, it's a winner-take-all system.
So are these
and for the most part,
these people just kind of honorary people who are named electors after the fact?
No, in most states, you'll see, I mean, I'm a voter in Maryland, and you'll see the names of presidential electors selected by the different parties for their ticket on the ballot itself.
Why that doesn't ring a bell with me. I'm voting in the district for a long time now, but I don't see those names. But let's move on there. So what happened? So President Trump believes the election is stolen. He goes to various states and they file various lawsuits and they're thrown out. They end up in the Supreme Court, and I guess the Supreme Court kind of passes on it. And then we get to January 6th. Are we to understand that Trump and his supporters wanted to prevent the results of the fair election from taking place, or being certified is the right word, I guess?
Yeah.
I mean, was it an attempted coup? Was it an attempted coup?
I would say that it's an attempt to exploit what you before referred to as holes or ambiguities, was the term I used, in the system. I mentioned before the election of 1876. One consequence of that is the passage in the 1880s of an Electoral Count Act, which still governs how electoral votes are supposed to be reported by the states and then counted in the Congress. But there have been questions about whether that act is constitutional or even whether parts of it sort of particularly make sense. So one effort was to exploit those holes, those ambiguities, to bring about a result satisfactory to Donald Trump.
Okay, so now we see in state legislatures new laws being passed. And when we were talking before this conversation, you mentioned Jim Crow and Jim Crow 2.0. I don't like that term, but talk a little bit about that and how that factors in. There are certainly amendments to the Constitution that guarantee the right to vote for many, many different people, right?
Yeah. So for the benefit of your listeners, when we talk about Jim Crow, we're talking about that period in the late 19th, the early 20th century, when African Americans find themselves segregated in schools and public accommodations and disfranchised, almost wholesale excluded from the political process in the southern states. And so President Biden, after Georgia passed its election law this spring, referred to it as Jim Crow for the 21st century. On the one hand, the language I think is going to strike many listeners as hyperbolic. When African Americans were disfranchised in the late 19th and through much of the 20th century, we're talking about 90+% of African Americans being unable to cast a ballot. The effect of the laws in Georgia are sort of in dispute. How much will they really restrict the right to vote? But I think the thing obviously that we have to keep in mind is that in Georgia, a state with about, I think it was around 5 million roughly ballots cast in the last presidential election, it's decided by about 12,000 votes. So even absent wholesale disfranchisement, because that's not what the Georgia law would do, it would nonetheless potentially, its critics fear, cut the vote sufficiently to tip the balance away from Biden, the 2020 winner, to a Republican winner, perhaps in the 2024 presidential election.
Mm-hmm. So how much control does the federal government have over national elections, and how much do the states have control over their national elections?
Yeah. So again, thinking back to the Constitution of 1787, only one half of one of the three branches of government was to be popularly elected. The U.S. House of Representatives, senators were selected by state legislatures, the president was picked by the Electoral College, judges were to be appointed by the president. So there's not really a right to vote in the original Constitution, and there's not a lot about voting requirements and procedures. Constitution says that in elections to the House of Representatives, the voting requirements that apply in the most popular, the largest branch of the state legislature will apply. States are allowed to set up their own procedures for running federal elections. The federal government in the Constitution reserves certain powers to sort of come in and set regulations of the, for example, time, place, and manner of holding elections for Congress, and has some powers as well over the selection of presidential electors. Then, as you referenced before, there are also, of course, the post-Civil War amendments and other amendments, which don't necessarily in their original language affirmatively guarantee a right to vote, but tell the states they can't do certain things. So the 15th Amendment, for example, ratified in 1870, says that the right to vote can't be restricted on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment uses similar language about denying the vote on the basis of sex and so on. Mm-hmm. And so the federal government in those amendments has the power to enforce them.
So we hear or read about HR1 and the Voting Rights Act. What's in play there?
So different laws that are currently under consideration in Congress seek to use these different constitutional powers of the federal government. That is, to regulate the time, place, and manner of holding congressional elections, but also the power of Congress to protect the right of individual voters. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a number of decisions over the last 10 years, has stricken or sort of rendered inoperative parts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The 1965 Voting Rights Act is entitled an act to enforce the 15th Amendment. So almost 100 years after its passage during the period of Reconstruction, there's a sense that that amendment and the rights that it was intended to protect are not going protected. So Congress is seeking to use sort of both of its powers, both its power to protect the rights of individual voters and also its power to regulate essentially the manner of the selection of its own members.
What would making Election Day a national holiday help the process in any way, shape, or form?
It certainly might. And so if you think back to our sort of initial comments at the beginning of this interview, we talked about sort of the state of democracy in America today. And so if we think about democracy as allowing not only more people to have the right to vote, but making it easier for people to exercise that right, making Election Day a federal holiday could do precisely that. People wouldn't have work obligations. It would be easier for them to get to their polling place. Another way, of course, to do that is to have what we've seen in a number of states, and what some states are now trying to roll back a bit, the expansion of early voting, the expansion of vote by mail. So
when you are opening up a newspaper, watching a television program or something like that, and this subject that democracy is in crisis right now because of these audits, Arizona, now Texas, challenges to the system, millions and millions of people not signing on to the fact that President Biden is the president of the United States. How does that hit you as a historian and as a human being?
Yeah, certainly. I think the term I would use is not necessarily that democracy is in crisis, but that democracy is contested. And again, it's been contested all along. We have a more democratic form of government now, more than 200 years later, than we did in 1787. But the gains in making for a more democratic government have come only through struggle, and they've had to be guarded from those who find that expansion of democracy threatening to their own interests and values. We've seen that at various points in American history. We saw it in the period following the Civil War, during and after Reconstruction. We're seeing it today. So the lesson here, I think, is that on the one hand, we should take some satisfaction in the democratic achievements that we've achieved in our form of government, but we also need to understand that they have to be preserved, that they're not inevitable, that they're not easy, and that history can go backwards.
30 seconds left. What do you want us to keep our eyes on over the next months or year?
Well, two things I would say. One are some of these state laws that we've talked about before. Some have passed, some are proposed, to see both how they're going to regulate the outcome of presidential elections, but they also matter in elections at every stage, right? From local to state government as well. Two, how the courts, the federal courts, treat those laws. Because if the federal courts allow them, then we're going to see restrictions on the right to vote. If the federal courts strike them down, we'll see the court acting as a protector.
We're at the end of our time. Dr. Stephen West, on faculty in the history department at Catholic University of America here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Dr. West, for the education. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
For information about This Is America and the World, visit our website, thisisamericatv.net, or our YouTube channel, This Is America TV, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can listen to all of our ambassador interviews on our podcast, The Ambassador Series. It's available on our website and iTunes. Underwriting for This Is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotondaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy.